Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our winter lecture series. I have a little minute of housekeeping. Please turn your cell phones off. This is being recorded. It will be YouTubed, and you don't want your cell phones ringing in the middle of a presentation. Also, be careful when you whisper something to your neighbor. Very sensitive sound in here, and believe it or not, it picks it up on our YouTube. So hold your conversations until after we're done. I want to acknowledge the sponsors of our Camp Chesapeake talk. We need to thank the Bayside History Museum, the Calvert Library, the John Hanson Daughters of the American Revolution, and then we need to give a special shout out today for Roland's Grocery Store, because they are a wonderful local grocery store. They sell all of our books for us. So this book is available at Roland's as well as the Bayside History Museum. Last but not least, Mickey is hiding in the corner. We thank our town council member, Mickey Hummel, who is our IT guru, records everything for us, YouTubes everything, and we don't know what we would do without him. So I have two small announcements. There is a barn quilt tour that is sponsored by the Arts Council and the Calvert Library. And when you leave, Richard is going to give you a flyer about that tour. It'd be a wonderful opportunity for you to see the county, have a nice lunch at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. And then I want to also mention that when you see this picture up here, thanks to our Arts Council and a recently hired artist, we're going to have a beautiful mural of these four guys standing right here on our outside wall at this height, so that kids walking up and down the street can go stand in front of the mural and get their picture taken with the four guys that went to Camp Chesapeake in 1953. Last but not least, because he's just sitting so quietly in his chair, we were so fortunate in March of 2024 to meet the acquaintance of Colonel Fred Gregory. When Vincent finishes his presentation this morning, we have a special treat for everyone in the audience. Colonel Fred Gregory is the second from the left in this picture, and he's going to come up and talk to you about what it was like to go to Camp Chesapeake in 1953 and 1954. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Vincent Turner graduated from the University of Maryland with a master's in historic preservation just this past spring, May of 2024. He earned his BA in history from St. Mary's College, and he got an AA in history from the College of Southern Maryland. Vincent grew up in Calvert County. Actually, his parents and his fiance are here today to hear him talk. He's worked at the Bayside History Museum since 2013. His first job at the museum was to digitize documents and make records for objects in the museum collection. Since that time, he's worked his way up to collections manager, and he's the vice president on the board of our museum. He has conducted 3 architectural surveys of North Beach. He's currently working on a project to document each property in the town. He recently began working a full-time job at EHT Traceries in Washington, D.C. as a historic preservation specialist. Last year, he co-authored 2 books with myself, North Beach Yesterday and Today, and Camp Chesapeake. Vincent?
Thank you, Grace Mary. That was a wonderful introduction. And in case you're wondering, this is what the book looks like here, Camp Chesapeake. So we actually brought a couple of copies here if you'd like to purchase some after our talk today. And if you want to, since both authors are here, we could sign it for you. But that's completely up to you. Oh, Mickey, it doesn't want to work. Oh, there we go. All right. So, Camp Chesapeake. This is probably not something familiar to most folks. Grace Mary spent 3 or 4 years trying to figure out where Camp Chesapeake was, what Camp Chesapeake was, any kind of information about it. The first mention of this particular camp that we had found was in the Camp Roosevelt papers, which were saved by her father, Thomas Reimer. And it was just little notes here and there. Where was Camp Chesapeake? When was Camp Chesapeake? There was actually a small book that Grace Mary was the only person we found that she actually had a copy of it. Believe it or not, right? It's a small little yellow pamphlet here. So, History of Scouting, 1910 to 1974. The National Capital Area Council, which is the council here in the DC region, they had printed this up as a history of their council. And Grace Mary's father kept a copy for whatever reason. We're very thankful for it, because this actually had a little bit more information on Camp Chesapeake in it than we realized. It also talked about the history of scouting in this area and the issues of discrimination and integration within the Scouts. It provided a very good basis, a very good background for our research for Camp Chesapeake. And actually, this bottom bullet point down here is a sentence that was inside of this book, and it helped us, it gave us a little piece of that puzzle, that final picture, to help us put it together. So Camp Chesapeake, we know, was at least from 1951. And 100 acres is a rough estimate. We found it's mostly accurate. And the Eugene and Agnes Mayer Foundation. Does anybody know who they were involved with in DC? Yeah.
Washington Post.
Yeah. Washington Post. And they play a very important part in this puzzle later on. I'll show you something that I found in the Washington Post I was very surprised by. And then Fred completely floored me with his stuff. So, just a few of the organizations that we reached out to try and figure out where was Camp Chesapeake, when was it, who was involved with it. And all of these organizations, all these people, nobody had heard of it. Nobody knew anything at all about this Boy Scout camp. In the end, we ended up writing 2 grants to help fund the book, to help fund the research, to help put things together. I ended up searching through a lot of DC newspapers, because newspapers are probably the best source of information out there, especially for small local things. And back then in the 50s and 60s, the newspapers carried a lot of local stories, not so much today where it's more national. We had a talk on Camp Roosevelt. Actually, Grace Mary gave this. And it's on our YouTube channel, so if you want to check that out, you can go ahead and watch it. And actually, it turns out that somebody very special in this audience watched this talk, and it inspired him to reach out to us. And that's what began our story here. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, because I'm sure all of you are probably not super familiar with the history of scouting in the DC region. And actually, the DC chapter of the Boy Scouts, they were one of the earliest in the nation, which figures it's a national capital, right? Now, from my research, and from the book that Grace Mary had found, we were able to piece together a little bit of this story here. So, Boy Scouts never were officially segregated. They didn't pass any laws about it, any ordinances, anything like that. But because the local councils were the ones in charge, they tended to base their discrimination based on how their churches were organized, how their schools were organized, what local laws were. And so in Washington, D.C., for instance, Black Scouts could not join the white units. So they ended up forming their own units. And one of these was Troop 520. It's one of the earliest references we found to a specifically Black Boy Scout unit in the area. You had lots of local leaders. So if you look at the second point here, you can see some of the jobs, some of the people involved with these scouts. Very well-educated people. People that saw the children as the future, that wanted to raise great leaders. In the early 1930s, the 6th Division here, they were organized in Washington, D.C., and they basically oversaw all of the Black Scout units. And they helped to organize them, they helped to do camping trips and educational programs. And Lucius Young here, he was the first field executive appointed for Black Scouts. And actually, there was a Boy Scout camp, YMCA camp that was here in Dares Beach, 1931, 1932, named Camp Young. and it was a combined effort of the YMCA and the Boy Scouts. And it was only a temporary camp. The people organizing Dares Beach, they didn't want to have a permanent camp there, but they did have some scouting, and that was actually the first black scouting in Calvert County. Now, Aaron Russell, he was that dentist that was on that last slide there. So they actually transformed the 6th Division over into the Russell and the Douglas divisions, and that was to help manage just the sheer number of scouts. There's a huge interest in getting children into these programs because they provided educational opportunities, they provided trips around the country, around the state and into different areas, getting them out into the countryside, out of the cities at the time. Now just imagine, right, DC in the 20s and 30s, there's no air conditioning. It's ungodly hot in the summer, so spending 2 weeks out here in Maryland, shoot, anybody would take that opportunity. And lots of scouts did. So it experienced, the black Boy Scout units and the white units too experienced tremendous growth through the 1930s and 40s and participated in a lot of war effort drives during the Second World War as well. We have little bits of history here just for some of the other local camps. It's all covered in our book too, so if you want a more in-depth, I highly recommend reading that. Which brings us to Camp Chesapeake. So 1951, purchased about 100 acres. These quotes here actually come from that yellow booklet, The History of Scouting here. And you'll notice here, right? So Camp Chesapeake was progressively developed by weekend work parties of Negro Scouts and Scouters under the leadership of Francis A. Gregory. Now, who's the man that helped us publish this book? Fred Gregory? This is Fred Gregory's father. He helped to establish Camp Chesapeake along with his good friend Lem Penn, who was a tremendous civil rights advocate during the time period. And this is a favorite quote of Grace Mary's, so we have to put it in here, of course, right? In carving Camp Chesapeake out of the wilderness, uncommon devotion became a common virtue. This was a labor of love. These were parents who saw opportunities for their children and dedicated weekends. Could you imagine driving in a 1940s car all the way from DC down here to the southern end of Calvert County down in Lusby, and then you work all weekend and then you go back and work 5 days a week and then you come back the very next weekend to do it all over again? You couldn't do this if you didn't love your children, if you didn't see that hope for the future. And I find that very inspirational. Now, unfortunately, Camp Chesapeake, it really didn't last that long. Remember when I said the Scouts, they weren't officially segregated, but in the 1950s, there was this tremendous push for integration of everything. And the Boy Scouts officially integrated in 1955. They said, no more of these separate units, we're going to combine everything. This just doesn't make sense to do it this way. And so Camp Chesapeake lost its purpose because Camp Roosevelt, which is up here in Chesapeake Beach, and was much bigger and could accommodate all of these scouts, just took over those opportunities. And so Camp Chesapeake was actually sold the very next year, 1956. So it was only a short-term camp, but it was very important to the people who went there, to the people who built it. And that's why this story is important for us to tell today. Now, Fred Gregory here, he saw Grace Mary's talk on Camp Roosevelt, and at the very end, she said, we're looking for Camp Chesapeake. If anybody has any information, please reach out to us, right? So just remember that in the future. If you ever have big questions, don't be afraid to ask, because you never know when somebody's going to see it and say, oh, hey, by the way, I have something for you. So Fred Gregory, he saw this talk, and he decided to reach out to us in March of 2024. And it turns out that he still had all the photographs from when his father helped to build the camp, from when he was a little tiny scouter. He remembered everything like it was yesterday. It was amazing talking to him and hearing him talk about the camp and the different locations and what he remembered doing as a boy. And actually, this is really impressive to me anyway, he went on to be the first black astronaut to command a space shuttle mission. I mean, he was acting head of NASA for a little while, and what he said to us was that being a Boy Scout was one of his proudest memories. And I don't know, I started tearing up a little bit when I was talking to him the first time. And it's like, okay, we'll do a second interview so I can write it all down. And then we had a Calvert conversation with the library, and Fred Gregory was actually a surprise guest, and he talked about his time, as a scout and his life. And so I'm going to share with you some of the photographs that he shared with us. They're in the book too. So Francis Gregory, so that's Fred's father over there. Nice handsome man there. Shoot, that suit fits nice. And then of course here's Fred, same time in his scout uniform. Now, I'm very thankful to him for sharing these memories and for helping me get all the labels right. These are some of the photographs of the actual campsite itself. So when the Boy Scouts used it, they had these tents which were up on wooden platforms. And then you had these canvas tents here with the wood poles. And so that's pretty much what they were living out of for a week or two at a time down here in Camp Chesapeake. You can see everybody having a good time. Now, when I was talking about the Washington Post earlier, right, when I was digging through newspapers, I actually came across this photograph in one of the newspapers, and I was blown away. I was like, oh my God, I actually found a photograph of Camp Chesapeake in the newspaper. This is amazing, right? And it was in the Washington Post. So, down here, Eugene and Agnes Meyer Foundation, to help purchase Camp Chesapeake. Here's the photograph, here's the proof that they cared, that they were down there. And then Fred said, oh, I have this photograph here, which is, and notice it's not the same exact photograph, right? It's very similar, so they were probably taken like right one after the other. But that's him right there. And that's him in the newspaper right there. Here's some more activities. We have the flag raising here. And then inside of one of the tents, you can see it's actually pretty nice. They got a metal bunk bed there, and got some cinder blocks to stack things on a wood platform, so you're not on the ground. It's actually pretty nice. Here's some of his fellow scouters here. Very proud to be Boy Scouts. You can see he got a little bump on his head, because you're out in the wilderness, right? And boys will be boys and tumbling around. Showing off some hatchet skills. And actually, Fred still had his hatchet with his engraved leather cover for the axe head. And it's at the Bayside History Museum now. We have an exhibit on Camp Chesapeake. So you have to come visit us and check it out. It's really cool. So, all of these talks and all of these photographs and memories, and, Fred told us that he wanted to go and visit the site of Camp Chesapeake. And he was the one that actually helped us pinpoint it, because no place, no information we found said, oh yeah, it's right exactly here at the end of this road on this, this address, nothing. But he goes, oh yeah, it's right over here, and I think it's by the Calvert Cliff State Park, and we looked, and sure enough, there it was. All these years later, he remembered it. It was crazy. So, Grace, wonderful woman that she is, she reached out to Senator Michael Jackson, who's the representative for this area, and arranged a trip for us to go and check out Camp Chesapeake. And so Fred and Grace Mary and I and a bunch of members of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources actually went out to Camp Chesapeake last year to go look at it, and so that Fred could walk where he used to walk when he was a boy. And I'll give you a little bit of history of the area as I was researching and pulling these things together. So it turns out that the original campsite was a YMCA camp. It was for YMCA in Annapolis. They bought about 100 acres or so in January of 1932, and why they bought it in Lusby is because the Baltimore YMCA had just bought land in that same area the year before and established Camp Conoy, which is a much bigger YMCA camp, but the Annapolis one, they wanted their own camp, so they decided to buy right next door. And that way they could also use some of the adjoining facilities, and they could help each other out. But that's why they ended up all the way down in the middle of nowhere back in the 1930s. In Calvert County. So they ran camps all the way up until World War II, basically, and then, of course, all the men were involved with the war effort. So they tried to start it up again, but it only ran for about 3 seasons, and it became too expensive, so the YMCA ended up selling the camp. And it actually went to Louis Goldstein's father, Goodman. He bought the property, because he bought a lot of property in Southern Maryland, and that was actually who the Boy Scouts purchased it from in 1954. And then they ran their camp, 1952, operated through 1954, my apologies. But then the Girl Scouts of the District of Columbia purchased it in 1956, and it became Camp Bay Breeze. And they ran it all the way through 1974, and then they actually did a land swap with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So they swapped this for a camp that was over in Charles County, and that's where they continued to do their activities. However, the campsite today is still known as Camp Bay Breeze in their honor. So here's an aerial photograph from the 1930s. So this right here, you can see just this little thin strip road going all the way through. It's a dirt road. This is like an activities field where they do like sports, and recreation, parade ground. And actually they had a shooting range here too in the later 1930s. So the YMCA, they built all these little buildings down here. They were all located at this end of the site, the closest to the bay here. And they ate pretty well from what I could tell from the reports. You get fried chicken dinners, fruit, eggs, bacon, everything you can imagine. They're very well taken care of. And first aid was actually provided by a local doctor who lived in Prince Frederick. So next it became Camp Chesapeake, of course. And this photograph is actually from 1957, so it's about 2 years after Camp Chesapeake closed, but it still shows you roughly what it would have looked like at the time of Camp Chesapeake. You'll notice up there it says Camp Bay Breeze and Children was actually written on the label, which I thought was pretty cool. So the Boy Scouts, they started informally camping here in 1951, formally established in 52, operated through 54. I found some references that they may have done some activities in 55, but nothing official. And it was here that they actually really improved the campsite. So this was like way out in the middle of nowhere in the 1940s and 50s. No electricity, there was pretty bare essentials. And actually, Fred's father helped to establish electricity at the camp. He was the one that got a generator installed and helped to install all of the electric wiring for the camp, so that way they could have lighting and they could have refrigeration. Safeway actually donated a walk-in icebox for their mess hall so they could have fresh food. I mean, I'm telling you, this was a labor of love establishing this camp. I found roughly about 85 boys a week in the summer, typically in August. That tended to be the most popular month, although they did rent out the campsite earlier, like in June and July, to other groups. This map here was actually drawn from memory by another Boy Scout who attended Camp Chesapeake. His name is Paul Reason, and he actually became the first black 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy. So I'm telling you, some really heavy hitters came to Camp Chesapeake. These Boy Scouts, I mean, y'all wouldn't mess with them. But he remembered all of these different sports. Like this was that sports field. You have the flagpole, you have your different activities, the paths down to the beach, where the mess hall was, staff cottages, the campsites. And even Fred remembered when they had to go and dig the latrines. You got to go to the bathroom somewhere, right? Absolutely amazing. So this is the map drawn from memory. And then in a minute, I'm going to show you a little bit more official maps. So the Boy Scouts didn't officially endorse segregation like I covered earlier, although it was practiced at the local level, and the national councils didn't do anything to stop it, at least not until the 1950s. So in 1955, the National Capital Area Council decided segregation no more, and they integrated all their units, and Camp Chesapeake lost its purpose. So this is a map that was actually produced by the Girl Scouts when they used Camp Bay Breeze. It's not to scale, very characterized drawings here, nice cute little cottages and teepees. You got wells here and outhouses shown by those typical little half-moon drawings, right? They added a number of different campsites and coach shelters in these different campsites, cleared it out a little bit more. There's a parking area established down here. Although it was basically run just like the Boy Scouts and the YMCA ran it. So today, if you look at a map of Calvert Cliff State Park, so this is something I found online, right? So Camp Chesapeake is right here, right at the northern end. You'll notice you really can't get to it from anywhere else in the park. You have to go through a road up here, and it's blocked off at the top. You have to go through the Maryland DNR to get access to the site. But they accommodate about 200 campers, so they still rent it out today, which I think is pretty cool. Here's an aerial photograph here, so there's that field. You can roughly see the road running down through the camp. And then I tried to play with a transparency here, so you have the newer aerial down here, and then the older shoreline. So you can see just how much is eroded. It's about 13 acres of property have eroded out since the time of Camp Chesapeake. This map gives you a little bit of a more clear picture here. I found this through the U.S. Geological Survey. So, of course, we have red, so you have 1942, so that's Camp Boyd Haven time, but also it probably wouldn't have been too different during Camp Chesapeake. And then yellow, 1993, and it's eroded out even more since then. And then Camp Chesapeake is right here on this little peninsula. So this is a sketch map that I drew of the property after we walked it during the visit last year. And it shows you where all the different ruins and pieces are. There's two creeks, so it's on a peninsula, and it is a steep drop down. It's got to be, I don't know, close to 60, 70 feet, something like that, down all the way to the Bayside here. But it just shows you some of the different sites and the different additions that are there, and that map is included in the book as well if you wanted to get a closer view of it. So, next I'm going to walk you through the campsite, because that's what everybody always wants to see. This is what you see when you get up to the entrance here, right? So Camp Bay Breeze Campground, right? So still named just like it was for the Girl Scouts. But you have all of these trespassing signs, and there's cameras back there and there's security, so the Calvert Cliffs nuclear power plant is actually right next door, so if you turn left the wrong way, you'll be meeting some nice security folks. So I recommend talking to NSDAR before you even attempt to go out there. I used the Girl Scout map because it was the most clear that I could, but it will show you basically where each of these photographs were taken. So the entrance to the campsite here is basically what it looks like. So it's still a dirt road, all the way since, the 1930s. Still that dirt road, pine scrub, just your typical coastal forest area. Campsite 1, they named it Chippewa, and it looks something like this. So they have little fire pits, a couple of picnic benches, and a helpful sign to tell you which way you're going. Very nice. Campsite 3, and I have no idea why they're labeled these numbers, so I have no idea why they're out of sequence. This is Campsite 3 here. And the sports field looks just like this. You have an open air pavilion that was put in later by the Girl Scouts and maintained by the states now. This is where your baseball diamond would have been, and your marching and other exercises, right? And you'll notice just how flat this is. I mean, it is an incredibly level field. And it turns out that the YMCA paid for a bulldozer and a grader to go down there and spend 12 hours each flattening this property. So this is the flattest piece of land you're going to find in like that whole area of Calvert County. And it was also the children from Annapolis and later DC could go and enjoy, play sports out here and enjoy the wilderness in southern Calvert. And over on the side there, so I'll go back one sec, you see this little flagpole right here, right? It's a little tiny thin rod. It's the same location as it was at Camp Chesapeake. So Fred remembered, he goes, oh yeah, I remember raising the flag all the way over across the field. So I think that's pretty cool they kept it in the same location. Campsite 6, they have modern toilets now, so you don't have to worry about digging your own latrines or going to an outhouse. Chemical compost, so much nicer than what they used to, right? And then here's the campsite itself, so you just lay out on the ground. Notice all the platforms are gone from the YMCA and Boy Scout days, so it's a little bit more rough now. At least you have modern bathrooms. The amphitheater, this was put in later. I want to say the Girl Scouts put this in because I couldn't find anything about the Boy Scouts or YMCA having something like this. But it's this nice little platform area with benches, and in the wintertime you can actually see out to the bay, which I think is pretty cool. And then one of the old outhouses still hanging around out there in the woods. I was like, okay, that's a little more rough on the inside. You can see animals having fun time with the toilet paper. So you occasionally have to clean that out. And then there's a historic photograph that I found of one of the outhouses, a little bit rougher shape. This photograph's taken, I want to say in the 90s, of one of those Camp Chesapeake outhouses. The equipment shed, so as you come down the road here from the amphitheater and the campsites, it winds down, so the equipment shed's right there. This is the platform. This is basically all that's left of most of these buildings and structures. But you can see that's a pretty substantial foundation for being out here. Could you imagine dragging all that concrete and cinder blocks down there in the 40s? That'd been pretty crazy. Just behind it was the generator shed. This is what Francis Gregory helped build. And there's actually still, there's an electric box here, there's wiring, all of it's still there. So it looks like it just kind of collapsed and they just dragged the generator out at some point. Just behind it was this structure which we're not really sure what it was for. It could have been a later Girl Scout building. All that's really left are these posts. So obviously it was a raised building, but we're just not sure what it was for. And on this map here, you can see that outhouses all, bumped out and around. What I found out, talking to Fred, was that he remembers digging this one, and there's the hole, just where he said it would be, all these years later. So it's a little bit more filled in now, the dirt's kind of piled over it, the building's no longer there. But these are some of the remnants of, that labor, that effort to build this into a place for the children of DC. These are some of the other structures. We're not really too sure what they were for. This one I think was maybe a well because it had a cap on it and inside it was all sand. So I think that's what it was for. And then this could have just been another foundation. But like I said, there's no official records left, so I'm not really sure. The dining hall. So this was a fairly substantial building. And we can tell that because this is the foundation. So it starts all the way over here and then comes all the way up to here. I mean, that's a really big building. And according to one of the Maryland DNR personnel, he actually remembers going into the building before they had to tear it down because it was basically just collapsing in on itself. And he said it was almost, it was basically like a one-story building and then it had a raised basement. So, I mean, that's a fairly large building for out here in the woods. And there used to be lockers down here. So he remembers when the state had to come in and take out the building because it was just a hazard. And they didn't want the children who still use the campsite to get injured. Then there's the parking lot. So you can actually see the bay right there through the trees. And then this is a pump house that was put in a little bit later. The Girl Scouts put that in so they would have fresh water being pumped into the campsites. It actually runs out to pipes at the different campsites and so they can have fresh water from the tap, which is really nice, really convenient. But something I want you to think about, right, as you're looking at this picture. Look at how much land and all of this was right here, all these cabins, all these structures, there was a well over here. And then look at this photograph, right? And it's like right up on the cliff edge there. That's where your 13 missing acres are. All of that is gone. All of those cabin sites have fallen into the bay. The Nature Lodge was the last structure from the YMCA camp and from the Boy Scout camp. It actually lasted all the way up until sometime between 2009 and 2013. So this is a photograph from when they were documenting the site in 2003. So you can see it had a nice fieldstone chimney. And I actually remember coming across newspaper accounts about the YMCA camp. And they did winter camps out here. And this was the only building they could use because it was the only one that had a fireplace. Everything else was freezing cold. So I just found it interesting that they'd even attempt that kind of thing. But I guess if you're a hardy YMCA camper, nothing's going to stop you. So you can see just how precarious the structure became towards the end of its life. I mean, the cliff was really eroding out from underneath of it. It was just unsafe. But this gives you a good idea of the size. And this was actually used as a staff cottage when Camp Chesapeake was here, and then when the Girl Scouts used the site as well. This is what it looks like today. So there's like little bits and fragments of it left. There's nothing really substantial anymore. But you can see just how close that cliff face is to this building. So the cliffside cabins here, all built by the YMCA. There was 8 total by the time they sold it in 1948. And that's where they all are today. Just right at the cliff edge there. And then something funny that I was pointing out to Grace Mary when we were up here is you see all that yellow? That's all pollen. So some of the trees had just started releasing their pollen, so it was just early enough for that. The old beach trail, so this is the one that Fred actually remembers walking down as a scout going down to the beach there. And it's just to the side of that pump house that I showed you, that cinder block structure that's represented here. So it would have been like right off to the side. And this is what it looks like. You can still actually see the road trace through the landscape. And unfortunately, you can't follow it all the way down to the beach, and I'll show you why in a second. This is the new trail that they had to blaze through. It's just, the old trail's right up here, so this is the new one coming through. And the camp hadn't been used for a couple of years because of COVID, so rain had eroded out pretty good sections of it. They're actually working on, they got a bunch of boulders that they're going to put in here and then cover it with dirt to build the trail back up. But you can see COVID really did a number on it for not using the site. And if you come down to the beach here, this is what it looks like at the cliffs. It looks just like Calvert Cliff State Park. And that's where the old trail ends. So it's, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 feet off the water surface there. So if you fall off the edge, that probably hurt a little bit. But it just shows you how badly this site has eroded since that time. And that's why it's important for us to document this site, to remember it and gather the stories about it, because so much of it has already been lost to the bay. And then this is the beach here. This is where all the kids, this is their favorite part, because they come down here and find shark's teeth, and fossils, and enjoy the water. And this is actually where many city children from Annapolis and from Washington, D.C. learned how to swim. This is where they would hold their competitions, where they would fish, and they would go walks up and down the beach with teachers and scientists who would show them what they were finding on the beaches. This was just a really cool site. And then, of course, in the background here, if you're familiar with the area, is the Cove Point liquid natural gas plant. So I got one of the big tankers was out there that day. So I thought that was kind of a cool photo. So that's the end of Camp Chesapeake. Although, it's not the end of the story. So last year we held a Camp Roosevelt reunion, because it turns out that Fred didn't just go to Camp Chesapeake, he went to Camp Roosevelt as well. And so we actually had all the old scoutmasters who, we had, how many people showed up for that, Grace? Was it 6 or 7 scouts who actually went to Camp Roosevelt, who were scoutmasters there. They came and shared their stories, and we got to walk on the property. This is the Camp Roosevelt mess hall here, and that's what it looks out over, the bay and the water. And it was really cool having all these scouts share their memories with us, and reminisce about their time, as boys in the 50s. In the 1950s, it's just, it's amazing to me. And here's the 2 gentlemen of the hour, Fred Gregory, Paul Reisman here, who shared their memories with us and helped to tell this story. And without them, I wouldn't be up here in front of you today. We wouldn't have published this book. We wouldn't have an exhibit at the Bayside History Museum. So I just want to say thank you to these 2 gentlemen. And with that, any questions? Yes?
Do you have more information on BEST and these Eagle Scout Awards?
So it was outside the focus of this particular talk and outside the focus of the book, but when I was going through newspapers, I did pull out things here and there, just to fill in the stories there. But I can talk to you about that afterwards, since it didn't really fit within the scope of what we're doing here. But yes?
This might be outside the scope too, but so with Camp Roosevelt integrating in the mid-50s, but I know our school systems didn't integrate really until the mid-60s.
Right.
So what experience, I remember, Grace Mary, how long ago was there was another interview with some of the old scout leaders, and I remember there were big conversations about some of the black scout leaders like hid in the trunk of a car to go to a movie theater, or drive to a movie theater, because they weren't allowed in. What sort of experience with the campers and the counselors, what else did you learn about that?
Camp Roosevelt was integrated way before the schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the school systems were separate, because it was within their own political jurisdictions. And even in D.C., they were supposed to integrate in 1955, and they didn't integrate until 1964. It actually took a separate Supreme Court case after Brown versus Board of Education to get the D.C. schools to integrate. The Boy Scouts were their own separate organization. They didn't have to follow any of the laws of anything else that were passed, especially after Brown versus Board of Education. That really allowed these organizations to decide for themselves, hey, do you want to keep existing, or do you want to, face the wrath of the Supreme Court? And so the Boy Scouts, since they never officially were segregated, they didn't see any reason to keep doing that. And so that became their policy. I'm sure that there were probably, scouts who weren't too thrilled to be working with, Black Scouts or Scout Masters. But I can't speak to that experience. It's not my lived experience. And I didn't really focus too much into that part. But maybe when Fred gets up, he'll be able to tell you a little bit about that. But great question. Yes?
What about Camp Roosevelt? You showed a nice picture. Is it still operational now? What's going on?
So Camp Roosevelt, it lasted until the 1970s, and then the National Capital Area Council purchased Goshen? I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah, Goshen, which is in Virginia. Much bigger site, thousands of more acres, and ended up selling the property to a group of local Calvert County people who ended up subdividing the site in about 14 different housing tracts. So it's now a private community. Although whatever the bigger buildings were that were able to be converted into houses, so like the mess hall or the caretaker's cottage, were actually converted into houses. And then some of the other little sites are still there. Like if you walk through the landscape, you can see like where foundations used to be and things like that. So it's now a private residence.
So where'd you have the reunion, the Camp Roosevelt reunion, and you showed a picture of it? What was that?
Yeah.
So yeah, what is that?
This is the mess hall, and the owners of the mess hall actually were very happy to have the Scouts back and come and talk about their memories, because they actually had this huge map that Grace Mary gave them that shows Camp Roosevelt at its prime, and the owners were they were more than thrilled to have all these Scouts there and talk about their time, and it was a very cool experience. It was private property owners who said, "Hey, would you like to hold a reunion here?" And we're like, "Yes, please." Yes.
The reunion, was the oral histories recorded?
I was writing them down as it was going. One of the things that we did was we met at the museum first, and I used my phone to record as the people were talking and going through questions and reliving their memories. So now we just need to do the oral transcription, which, as you know, takes quite a while. But I'd love to sit down individually with each of the Scouts and talk to them and ask them questions and maybe fill out a few of the blanks. So yes. All right.
Introduce her.
Yes. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to my friend Fred, if you'd like to come up here and speak with the audience. Of course.
Second time in 3 weeks I've been here. Let's start. Initially, it was mentioned about Francis Gregory and Lem Penn. And Francis, or Dad, was my dad. And Lem Penn was a very close friend. Lem Penn, if you know any history of DC schools, was a principal at Dunbar High School, and my dad was principal of Armstrong High School, which were major rivals, and they were right across the street from each other. But what Vincent talked to you about, the travels of the weekend, they did, I can remember that very clearly, riding down the road. I don't know, he dragged me along for everything. I was probably 11 or 12. Developing this camp, and I had no idea where it was, in fact. But my friend Paul Reason, who you saw his picture, Paul said it was in Lusby. And of course, we both went to the map to try to find out where Lusby was. And it was a post office, obviously. So knowing the city of, whatever it is, the entity of Lusby, gave us a general idea of where the camp was. But did not give us a very specific area. We had a fine time. I was in the Russell Douglas Boy Scout, what do they call it, Region A, I don't know.
Division.
Yeah, division. And we had Cub Scout troops, packs and Boy Scout troops in DC. And I saw one of your names was Portia Webb, Portia, I forgot her last name, but she was my den mother. And you got that in the, Ben Henley's name was up there. He was a classmate of my mother's at Dunbar High School, and so all of this stuff is like family to me. In 1953, and I think that may have been what the picture of the four of us had occurred. We had the first integrated Boy Scout troop, and so it was ahead of the desegregation of DC schools, and we went on a jamboree to Irvine Ranch, and at that time it was a ranch owned by the Irvines, which is now a huge community now that none of us could afford to live in. But it was an orange grove, and so we went on probably the first integrated Boy Scout activity from the DC area. So I think DC was, the National Capital Area was very far ahead in the integration of boys from all communities at that time. 53 was the first year that Camp Chesapeake, I think, opened. And as Vincent said, it was only open for a couple of years, 53 and 54. I think the picture before of us, I think, was in 1954. And in that picture, can you pull that up?
The one from the cover?
Yeah, the one on the cover.
Got a lot of slides in here. What was that?
Okay.
Here we are.
We are on that field, by the way, that Vincent talked about, and the flagpole would have been, well, that's Paul Reason on the far side, the Admiral, and I'm second from the left here. That's in 1954. 1954, 1955, Paul and I went on a trip, if there are any Boy Scouts here. I still call them Boy Scouts, even though they're, Scouts now? They're still Boy Scouts. We went on to a camp in northern New Mexico, Philmont Scout Ranch out there. And we went by bus, and all of that activity was integrated. So I think DC was way ahead in those days, at least for a kind of quasi-southern area. We had amazing times, and I guess we figured that all of us had the same kind of interests and goals, and that kind of overtook any racial issues, and I don't remember any at all on these trips that we made. Actually, the integration in DC was in the middle 50s, and I had gone, Paul and I and all our friends had been in segregated schools in DC. My elementary school was on the east side of Howard University. It was called Mott School. We call it the Mott School because it was absolutely an amazing school, as were the black schools in DC. The teachers were folks who were not able, were highly educated, but unable to get government or commercial jobs. And so they taught. And so we had the cream of the crop that taught us. And so our elementary school was on the east side of Howard, and our junior high was on the west side of Howard. Banneker Junior High, which is now a high school, not a charter high school, but a special high school, a science engineering school, science math school. But in 1954, schools had integrated in DC. And so I went then to, in the 9th grade, a junior high school in my neighborhood, which was in deep southeast of DC. And that's Sousa Junior High. And that's where I met the former mayor, Mark Frazier. Mark Frazier and I were classmates at Sousa. And he lived kind of down the hill from me. I lived on Massachusetts Avenue, which at that time was a dirt road in southeast, the intersection of Massachusetts Avenue and Alabama Avenue. And Mark lived kind of down Pennsylvania Avenue from us, and that's where but that was the first integrated schools in DC occurred in the fall of 1954. And then I went to Anacostia High School and graduated from there. Now, if I had stayed, if the schools had remained segregated, I would have gone to the high school that my parents went to and that my grandparents went to, and that was Dunbar High School in downtown DC. But we kind of scattered when schools integrated. We had an amazing Boy Scout adventure, and someone asked about Eagle Scouts. Awards did not seem important at that time. And I think Paul had the highest rank, he was a Life Scout. And I think I had, I may have been a Life, but I remember being a Star. I had about 35 merit badges, but they were the wrong ones. And so I think all of us could have been Eagle, but it was not one of the emphasis that we had in the Scout troop. It was more the adventure. And so we did a lot of camping. As I said, we went to jamborees, camping here at Camp Chesapeake and also Camp Roosevelt. Jamborees and Philmont Scout adventures and things like that. So that was pretty much what our summers were involved in, whatever. So that's kind of an overview. Arthur Weisaker on the far left over here, his mother was a very prominent medical doctor in DC. And whenever Arthur and us traveled, his mother always gave him a big bag of pills. And so we called him, his nickname was Pill. So that was what it was me. And then Bobby Reed next to Paul, and between Paul and I. And neither Paul and I, neither he nor I can remember exactly where Bobby went. But it really was an exciting time, and we really enjoyed it. So with that, that's kind of an overview of everything. Is there a question? And I can, yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know, did you run into Calvert County Black Boy Scouts or Black Boy Scouts from other places? You all were from DC, you said you went to jamborees.
Yeah.
And given how Calvert and Southern Maryland, all of Maryland, so did you run into any Boy Scouts from the area?
Well, we were in the National Capital Area, and the National Capital Area included DC, Maryland, Virginia. Were they the three?
Yeah.
Just those three. And so, in fact, I wish I could tell you that Jim Jones was from Calvert County, but I never knew. You know, I was a counselor also at Camp Chesapeake. Camp Roosevelt. And I was waterfront, so I taught swimming and canoeing and boating. I also did taught cooking and camping, Camp Lot. And I stayed there until they opened a new camp. We had a lot of camps down at Fort Acre Hill. And so I went down there and ran activities for 2 years. And I can remember high schools that some of the counselors came from. But honestly, I can't tell you if somebody was from Calvert County or whatever. If you say a high school name, I might remember that, yeah, that person. But in our trips, for example, the jamborees are they came from the National Capital area, and so they were from all three of the areas. And I have pictures of those too, so maybe someone would be able to identify. Anyone? All right.
That's fine, thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Okay, we want to thank everyone today. We have books up here. You can see Vincent if you would like to buy a book. They're $20. We really want to thank Colonel Gregory for coming over and sharing his memories of Camp Chesapeake today with the audience. Next Sunday, we have a lady from St. Mary's County. Her and her husband wrote the book about everything that was before the base is the title of the book, and it's about Pax River. So it should be a very, very interesting talk of what used to be there compared to what is there today. And all of our talks are from 1 to 2 o'clock. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day. And feel free to talk to anybody here and ask them any questions. Thank you.